Is the microphone working? It is. Okay, good. Thank you so much for this great invitation to the Human Rights Research and Education Center. Also, I think can you just keep track of the time?
Yes.
And after 5 minutes before, like after 15 minutes, just let me know.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I think we have to be careful when we mention Carlton because I think there's a few Carlton people here. And so we have to be nice to them, you know, and sort of feed that exchange. And I'm thrilled to see some familiar faces in the audience. I've been in Washington for 3.5 years, but I always come home. I'm actually one of the few people who's from Ottawa, Pierre-Gilles also. But it's just so nice to come back and see familiar faces, friends, colleagues, and fellow students. So thank you for the warm welcome. So I just wanted to before going any further, I just wanted to kind of do a disclaimer and let you know that I'm not speaking now on behalf of the Government of Canada. I'm an independent researcher working part-time on my PhD in Canadian Studies at Carleton University. I'm very inspired by a lot of the work that I'm doing, and that experience is feeding this analysis, which is ongoing. So the proposed focus of my dissertation is the intersection between homophobia, human rights, and international affairs. And for me, this is part of a broader continuum on my research. And as Pierre-Gilles mentioned, I did publish in 2005 Pink Blood, Homophobic Violence in Canada, which is it was the first analysis of homophobia and transphobia as hate crimes in Canada that really looked at all of Canada. And it is in the U of O and Carleton libraries, I believe both in English and in French. So I was going to bring a copy, but I was carrying hand luggage onto the plane, so it was kind of heavy. So I wanted to talk today about the evolving nature of human rights. And before I forget, I do have a business card which is linked to George Washington University, where I'm also a visiting scholar in Washington. And I did pass around cards, so if anyone didn't get a card and wants one, then please feel free to grab one. It has my Gmail address on it, so it's an easy way to get a hold of me in case you have any questions about my research. So I wanted to sort of delve into how human rights discourse has evolved, especially since World War II. And interesting that most Western democracies now make human rights a central component of their foreign policies and their domestic policies. And what we find in developed countries is that they tend to devote significant resources towards the monitoring and analysis of human rights, both domestically and internationally. And so with this trend has also the concept of human rights has evolved from the rights of man, in quotation marks, to all these different groups now. If you look on the website, say, of the UN Human Rights System, and you look at all the special rapporteurs, they have special rapporteurs on the human rights of women, disabled people, human trafficking victims, victims of toxic waste, victims of mercenaries, victims of the war on terror. So these are all now being construed as human rights concerns. And I wanted to take one strand, which was LGBT. And before 1990, it was just never discussed in international fora, and certainly not using LGBT. It was gay and lesbian, or lesbian and gay was usually the term that was used. And yet today what we see is that there's now been this proliferation of discourse on LGBT issues, so that now even ministers, our Minister of Heads of State, the UN Secretary General are all now calling on states to do more to protect sexual minorities. Now this has entered also into what we would call generally mainstream human rights organizations such as Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. Now LGBT is a very much a central, is now a component of the human rights that they monitor. And of course there have been over the last 20 years more specialized groups like the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, which are really linked to the efforts of the grassroots civil society organizations. So when it comes to human rights diplomacy, you do have the bilateral versus the multilateral human rights diplomacy. And I want to actually focus more on the multilateral, and just to sort of just a very quick overview, there are many multilateral organizations that now include human rights discourse and LGBT rights in their discussions. Not just the UN and the Organization of American States, but also the African Union, the European Union, the Commonwealth, the Francophonie. So this is now entering into the discourse. And what I call it a triangular dynamic between, it's the interaction of three distinct actors. You have the diplomats at these multilateral missions, you have the international organizations and the secretariats of these missions, and then you have civil society. And all those three components it's a very dynamic situation where one is feeding into the other, which is feeding into the other. So it's an exciting environment to be working in. I don't want to focus on the UN human rights system because it is huge, but just to quickly give an overview, you have the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Novanathan Pillay, and one of the breakthroughs in the LGBT issues in the UN human rights system was this resolution on LGBT rights that took place at the Human Rights Council on July 14th. 2011, and it was called Human Rights, Sexual Orientation, and Gender Identity. So I'm showing this as this was a sort of a turning point for global discourse on LGBT issues. It was the first of its kind. It passed 23 to 19, and you'll see on that list the countries that were in favor and the countries that were against this resolution. And there were 3 abstentions. And I think when you look at that list, you can sort of draw some of your own conclusions, or maybe make some generalizations about the types of what some of the patterns are, I'll say. So and since we are going to be focusing on Latin America, what's interesting is you don't see any Latin American countries that voted against this resolution. They all voted in favor of it. And granted, it's not scientific because the Human Rights Council, of course, only has a certain percentage of all the UN member states at any given time, but it's clear that they're often reflecting many of the attitudes of their neighbors. And so what we've seen over the last few years in Latin America has been a complete dynamic change in LGBT rights. It was interesting because I was at a conference in Washington at American University last May. It was the LASA conference on Latin American Studies, and there was a special discussion on Latin American LGBT rights. And the feminists were saying, isn't it interesting that we've had more progress discussing LGBT rights and changing those laws in Latin America than we have on, say, abortion rights and reproductive rights in Latin America. So it's this ironic and interesting twist that an area that 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, there were many stereotypes in Latin America about the relative homophobia in the society and the intolerance. And what we can see is a real change in that perspective. The UN report was also a turning point because so what this UN resolution did is it requested a report to come out. And this report, which was issued on November 17th, 2011, really was the groundbreaking, covering all the territory of where the discrimination takes place. So in the first section, it talks about the various international instruments which should be protecting LGBT rights, but is not very often. The second was really more of a graphic depiction of the types of violence that take place in various regions around the world. Section 3 was on the discriminatory laws, including 76 countries that still criminalize same-sex activity, including 5 with the death penalty, and Section 4 on various discriminatory practices. Now, another important part of the UN system is the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, which I'm sure many of you are studying, and to me, it's just such a rich area for discourse to study because everything is out there on the table and you have the transcripts of these discussions and it's a peer review mechanism, so every 4 months there's a new group of countries that are being evaluated by other countries. And when you go in there and look at the transcripts, it's very interesting how many questions about LGBT rights are being discussed on the world stage right now. So although people criticize the UN human rights system, one great contribution is that it's putting the words out there. So for example, on April 29th of last year, the UK asked Russia, what is the government of Russia doing to ensure the protection of the rights of LGBT people, including, etc., with reference to the homosexual propaganda law. So the effect of this is to get they may not get answers, and the answers may not be very clear, but at least they're getting the questions out. So now I want to move to the Inter-American human rights system, and in 1948, the Charter of the Organization of American States was signed, and that led to the establishment of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which is based in Washington, in 59. And in 61, the commission started doing their first on-site visits to investigate human rights issues in the Americas. And so this grew into a regional human rights instrument called the American Convention on Human Rights, which came into force in 1978, and 23 OAS member states are parties to that convention, not Canada and the United States or quite a few of the English-speaking Caribbean countries. And what it does is it also essentially created the Inter-American Court of Human Rights based in Costa Rica. And so for the 23 member states of the hemisphere that have signed the convention and recognized the court, then the complaints that come from the commission move up the system, and if the state does not comply with those human rights issues, it can be moved up to the court level. So just to give you a little snapshot of what is being done in terms of LGBT human rights in the Inter-American system, there are basically 4 ways that the Inter-American system has raised awareness of LGBT rights. One is on the political level through resolutions that have been adopted at the annual OAS General Assembly, which takes place every year in a different city in the Americas. One is through the work of the Commission, one is through the work of the court, and one is through other inter-American organizations. So I wanted to just take you through, if we have enough time, some of the some of the ways that the LGBT issue has been engaged in the inter-American human rights system. So, so for example, resolutions on sexual orientation and gender identity have been adopted every year. And so this was the one, for example, from 2013. And so what it does is it's interesting to see from 2008 to 2013 how that annual resolution has gotten beefed up and changed over time. So in 2008, it was very generic and said, you know, basically one page talking about, you know, calling on the states to discuss and to be concerned about acts of violence and related human rights violations. And if you see, it's fascinating to see that same resolution year after year, which is all online on the OAS website. And by 2013, you have a very different